Hi, everyone. Bienvenidos, bem-vindos. I'm just waiting for people to sit. So, my name is Keila Grinberg. I am professor of Latin American history, but I'm here today in my capacity of She made my part.
Join me.
I'm my capacity until now director of the center. Before we start, I want to thank class staff for making this possible. Mateus, who is right here. Luz Amanda Hank, who is hiding there. Howard, who is right close to her. Luis and Katie and all of you that know class so well know how important our staff is for the center. So thank you. Welcome to the Afro-Latin American Studies at Pitt, a conference in honor of Jorge Reid. I'm not supposed to say much today, but I'm stealing a minute. I don't think I need to stress your importance to class, to the history department, to Pitt, to the field of Latin American studies in the US and in Latin America. You can just look around and you'll see. So I'll just mention one episode that you know already, of course, that it might have been in 14, 15, maybe. We were at one of the Afro-Latin American Studies conference together, and after hearing several criticisms of the ways in which the Workers' Party in Brazil, then in power, was handling affirmative action initiatives, you intervened and you said, "Folks, I'm too old to be pessimistic." So since then, this has become my life motto, but I didn't know it, that I would be here. Among all the situations that I could never imagine that will happen to me, that I will be here co-hosting this event with my colleague and friend, Michel Gobat, to you. I'm happy, proud, slightly intimidated to be the one here to inherit students, many of your books, some of your topics. I'll do my best to follow your example, and I will feel 100% accomplished if I can have 10% of your impact and, of course, your extraordinary optimism. Thank you. Obrigada.
Well, let me just join Keila and welcome you all here to Pittsburgh in honor of Reid's upcoming retirement, so they say. As you know, as you can guess, there's probably a bit of a tension between Roy and me. I'm the chair of the department, so I have other interests at heart, I guess. But no, thank you all for coming here, especially those of you coming from afar to discuss. And since we're maybe being recorded, I should probably say the pivotal role that Reid and Pitt more generally have played in the development of the field of Afro-Latin American history. I'm very glad that Keila put together such a fantastic panel that will discuss Reid's work in a couple of minutes. But I'm also very touched by the many of his former advisees who are here to both discuss the importance of Reid's work, scholarly work, but also the fantastic job he's been doing or has done in advising and in promoting our graduate mission. As the former DGS, I know your work very well, but I really haven't had a chance to meet many of you in person. So I'm very happy for this opportunity to finally meet you in person. I also want to, since I'm monopolizing the microphone right now, let me also just thank you also for helping us recruit, continue to recruit fantastic graduate students to our program who want to specialize in Latin American history. I'm not sure if this was the case in the past, but typically we hold an open house for all admitted students in March. It usually takes place in the lounge. You probably remember the lounge in the history department. I'm not sure when this started, but if you remember, there's this long side wall with two boards full of covers of books. I usually, when I was DGS, I would start the meeting. The first meeting would take place in the lounge by pointing the admitted students to those two boards. I'd start with the left board. Those are all the covers of the books of the faculty. And very quickly, I would pivot to the right side. Not so much because the board is more colorful, but because it has the covers of your books. And I tell the prospective students that one of our main goals is to have their books up there, the covers of their books up there at some point in the near future. So thank you very much for allowing us to have this fantastic recruiting tool in the form of the cover of your books. Now, who's in charge of that board? And so I think the board, both the one with the covers of faculty books and also the covers of the graduate student books, I think neatly embody what's going to be at the center of today's event. That is, on the one hand, we'll be discussing the importance of Reid's scholarly work, but also the critical role he's played in mentoring and training graduate students. There's a third element, however, that I don't think we'll talk a little bit too much today, but I really want to highlight, and that's the fact that Reid has been just such an exemplary departmental citizen. It's an applause. I don't have to give evidence and footnotes, but let me just give you one piece of evidence. This last Monday, we held a pretty informal meeting to talk about challenges many of us are facing in the classroom. There's a new generation of students, the so-called COVID generation. Reid was there, even though I think it's penultimate, and I think we're still on it, right? We can still negotiate this. Ultimate week of teaching, he was there. And he again said that he refused. At the end, he had his hand up, but he didn't really want to say anything, and we insisted. And of course, he said something that was precious. So since I'm here again, having the microphone, Reid, I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for being such a wonderful departmental citizen. Thank you so much. I'd like to hand over the microphone to Reid's neighbor in Crawford, Liann, because now we're going to be starting with the first panel. Is that right? Yeah. Okay. And the first panel will be on Reid's scholarship. So if Paulina, Lara, Marcelo, and also Alejandro, if you can come up front, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Getting situated. Hello, everyone. I'm Liann Tsoukas. I'm in the Department of History at the University of Pittsburgh, and I am in this glorious room of scholarly excellence and human engagement. I am, I believe, on today's program, the only person who does not teach, research, or study Latin American history. So when Keila asked me to do this, which I did so enthusiastically, it did begin to occur to me, why me? Why would you want me to kick off such an important panel about Reid's scholarship and influence in the field? Well, folks, I know what it is. It's because I'm Reid's work best friend. I confirmed this yesterday by telling him best friend. I did this and I insisted on his confirmation. He did some, and there were witnesses. So that explains this. So George Reid Andrews, as we know, is a distinguished professor of Latin American history at the University of Pittsburgh, and as part of our community here for 44 years, his impact as a scholar, teacher, and leader has been immeasurable. We start today with the celebration of his writing and academic influence. A panel of experts here has been assembled, colleagues and collaborators of Reid, who will offer us their insight into his influence and contributions in the field. With that, I will introduce who will be speaking today. We'll do these at once, and then if you'll just want to take your turns, and we'll transition and get the introductions up front. First, we have Dr. Paulina Alberto, Professor of African and African American Studies and of History at Harvard University. She's an historian of Afro-Latin lives, thought, and politics as they unfolded in the aftermath of slavery, with a focus on Brazil and Argentina. Her two single-authored books, Terms of Inclusion, Black Intellectuals in 20th Century Brazil, and Black Legend, are joined by two co-edited volumes, Rethinking Race in Modern Argentina, and most recently, Voices of the Race, Black Newspapers of Latin America, with Reid Andrews and another editor. Dr. Alberto's work has been widely supported and recognized. Her books have earned multiple awards, including the Roberto Rice Prize for the Best Book in Brazilian Studies, the Warren Dean Prize for the Best Book in Brazilian History, and most recently, the James Alexander Robinson Prize in 2017. Next, we will have Dr. Alejandro de la Fuente. He is the Robert Woods Bliss Professor of Latin American History and Economics, Professor of African American Studies and of History, and was the founding and continuing director of Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University. So many books in so many languages. Dr. de la Fuente's work focuses on race, slavery, law, and Atlantic history. A Nation for All, Race, Inequality, and Politics in 20th Century Cuba, Havana and the Atlantic in the 16th century, and the latest, Becoming Free, Becoming Black, Race, and the Law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana. With Reid Andrews, he co-edits the Afro-Latin American Studies and Introduction and the Afro-Latin American book series on Cambridge University. Additionally, Dr. de la Fuente is curator of 3 art exhibits, author or editor of the corresponding volumes, and is senior editor of the Journal of Cuban Studies. He is very recognizable around here because he was our colleague for many years before going to Harvard, and is especially recognizable. I once recognized him in a plane on the way to Miami, sitting behind him because of his hair. Next is our wonderful colleague, Dr. Lara Gotkowitz, Associate Professor of History at University of Pittsburgh, is an historian of modern Latin America with a focus on the Andes and Bolivia. She is author of A Revolution for Our Rights, Indigenous Struggles for Land and Justice in Bolivia, 1880 to 1952, which, by the way, was the winner of the John E. Fagg Prize for the best publication in the history of Spain, Portugal, and Latin America. Lara is editor of a collection of essays on indigeneity and racism entitled Histories of Race and Racism, the Andes and Mesoamerica, Colonial Times to the Present, and Dr. Gotkowitz is currently working on a book on Jewish refugees and anti-fascism in Libya in the World War II era. Finally, we have Dr. Marcelo Paixão. He is a Brazilian economist and associate professor at the University of Texas in Austin in African and African diaspora stories in conjunction with the Therese Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies. His expertise in ethnic and racial relations and inequalities in Brazil and Latin America have led to several books focused on race and labor relations in Brazil. His monographs in Portuguese will be read to you right now by the US historian in the room in English, because my Portuguese is not good. Reid did try to teach me some earlier this morning. And some of those translations for the English speakers in the room, The Legend of Enchanted Modernity, in which he analyzes the status of human race in the discourse of racial democracy, and how this understanding is joined to the problem of social inequality and racial hierarchies in Brazil. And finally, 500 Years of Solitude, Studies on Racial Equality in Brazil. And so with that, we would like to turn it over to you, our assembled experts, to give us some insight into Reid Andrews' scholarship and influence in the field. So thank you so much for being with us today. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I am more nervous about this than I have been about my job talks. I am so honored to be here and to have this opportunity to do what I think so many people would love to do, which is to say thank you to Reid for everything that he's done for the field. And Reid, it has to be said that you picked a really good time to retire. I'm going to start with an anecdote about my own trajectory that often comes to mind when I think of the impact of Reid's work. And then I'll branch out a bit from there. And I would warn you, it starts off a little bit gloomy, but it doesn't stay that way. I'm originally from Argentina, and I came to college in the United States at the age of 17, convinced that I was going to study forensic anthropology. My goal, which was probably not very original for someone of my generation who grew up in the shadow of Argentina's last military dictatorship, was to literally dig up the remains of that history, to try to reconstruct the identities that had disappeared. It was the early 1990s. President Menem had just issued pardons to military officers, and there were so many things about Argentina's recent past that I was driven to uncover. And I was convinced that anthropology was the way. So when I arrived at the University of Pennsylvania, I enrolled in anthropology classes, and I found myself a work-study job at the library of Penn's Anthropology Museum. My supervisor at the library, a man named Mark, was an African-American man who in his spare time read as many books about Black people in Latin America as he could get his hands on. And so I now realize that he was an early adopter of the field we now know as Afro-Latin America. He had traveled extensively in the region, and so we often talked as we shelved books. One day he asked me if, being from Argentina, I knew the meaning of the word trigueño. And I had only the vaguest notion. It's not a very commonly used word anymore, but I told him I understood it to refer to someone with a tawny or dark complexion, a wheat-colored skin tone. Argentines don't have a particularly elaborate vocabulary for discussing color, which, as many of you might know, is broadly understood to be white. But Mark explained that according to this book he was reading, trigueño was a term that referred to people of African descent. He brandished the book, and I read the title, The Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires. The who of where? I thought to give him a worldly nod. Like so many white Argentines of my generation, born too late to have any direct memory of a large Afro-Argentine population and past, and born too early to have witnessed the social movements that would emerge at the turn of the new millennium, I grew up having little to no concept of the Black presence in Argentina. This book completely changed my mind, and as it turned out, my life. I use this anecdote not just to illustrate the impact that Reid's book had on my personal trajectory, but because it's useful for thinking about the book's broader impact on national conversations about Blackness and African descent in Argentina and their shifting relationship to the country's history of violent erasures. Reid's book came out in English in 1980 at the height of the military dictatorship and its infamous disappearances. The terms disappear, disappeared, and disappearance appear hundreds of times in the book, although not once that I have found in direct reference to the victims of the Paixão. Still, I imagine it was impossible to write the word disappeared over and over again without thinking about its grim echoes in contemporary Argentina.
Indeed, as the Afro-Argentine movement gathered force in the 1980s and 90s, it began to use the language of human rights emerging from Argentina's particular experiences of repression and redemocratization, calling Afro-Argentines the country's first disappeared, los primeros desaparecidos. As early as 1985, the historian and journalist Eduardo Wigmalde used that as the title of a short article, although his bibliography did not include the Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires, which had not yet appeared in Spanish. The phrase primeros desaparecidos, first disappeared, appears in various interviews by famous Afro-Argentine activists thereafter, 1990. So this rhetorical strategy, which drew a conceptual equivalence with the victims actively disappeared by the proceso, called attention to the state's role in the project of disappearing Afro-Argentines in the 19th century through what was then understood as a kind of engineered demographic collapse or even genocide. The use of Afro-Argentine men as cannon fodder in wars, the community's relegation to living conditions that increased mortality and decreased fertility, for the state's symbolic and material investment in European immigration. As a strategy of denunciation, it was extremely powerful. But it left unresolved the question of how the Black population might reappear. And here, the conceptual equivalence with the political desaparecidos of the dictatorship was not a hopeful one. And this is where the Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires proved extremely generative for activists and academics alike. The book deployed what would become Reid's signature method, a combination of quantitative and qualitative sources and a finely tuned appreciation of local racial formations, to reframe the apparent disappearance as a process of statistical and conceptual erasure rather than demographic collapse. Afro-Argentines may have become statistically invisible and perhaps conceptually impossible, but they were still present. The distinction between disappearance and invisibility made a great deal of difference. It meant that there was a veil over the past, but not a gaping void. Afro-Argentine histories and presences could be reconstructed through archives, family memories and keepsakes, oral histories, newspapers, memoirs. This is what the book offered Argentines, the ability to see ourselves and our society differently. One of the best examples of this comes from the work of my colleague, the historian and anthropologist Liann. Some years ago, she conducted a striking interview with a woman who learned late in her life that she was an Afro-descendant, precisely by reading the Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires, by seeing in its pages the name of her grandfather and the portrait of another relative. She then, quote, put two and two together, understanding that she, many members of her extended family, and others in her community were of African descent. In this sense, the very certainty of continuous Afro-Argentine presences that Reid's book offered helped generate new questions, new possibilities, and new stories. Official statistics or stories about Black disappearance had limited us to the principle that seeing is believing, while telling us that there was nothing to see. But Reid's book flipped that logic, showing that the opposite was true. Believing or knowing that Afro-Argentines were very much present in Argentine society enabled seeing in new ways and sent new generations of historians into the archives with the conviction that they would find more stories to tell. As Liann had put it recently, without the Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires, the field simply would not exist. Reid's book, now 45 years old, has not only had it looks really its age very. It's not only helped to pry open the field of Afro-Argentine history, it has, I would argue, played a quiet but crucial role in the social processes that have shaped Argentine democracy in the 42 years since its return. The transformation in Argentina, in terms of public discussions of race and identities that are not just white or European, is one of the most noticeable changes I've seen in my lifetime. And there is no doubt that Reid's book was and continues to be a major point for this intellectual. I surveyed many of my Argentine colleagues, and they confirmed that as long as they have been working in this field, activists and academics alike have been citing Reid's book, with activists in particular using information like the census tables in the books as didactic material to help raise consciousness in their communities. I'd like to document this circulation more systematically someday, but for now, this impact on civil society is worth remarking and remembering, even or perhaps especially when democracy in Argentina and in other places is on shakier grounds. In retrospect, it's clear that Reid's audacious choice to write a doctoral dissertation and then a book on the history of Afro-descendants in a country that purportedly had none was a decisive step toward imagining that the history of Afro-Latin Americans could be told not only for the few countries that have historically recognized their significant African heritage, but for the region as a whole. Each of Reid's 3 monographs on Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay were first and foremost a deeply researched historical exploration of race making on local terms. Yet each of these books transcended the isolated case study, building toward an ambitious regional comparison by addressing 2 central questions. How did Afro-descendants experience and combat race and racism in their everyday lives? And how did national ideologies of whitening, racial democracy, and mestizaje shape or constrain these on-the-ground social relations? In his work on each of these national cases, Reid's deep knowledge of histories of slavery, abolition, and post-emancipation societies across the Americas, including the United States, was never far from view, yielding insights that could only come from informed comparison and increasingly from attention to transnational connections. All of this is impressive enough, but Reid has also secured his place in posterity by making his way into popular culture. And no, it's not the example you're thinking of. Granted, there are certain aspects of a wholly fictional character played by Nick Offerman in the movie Me and Earl of Dying that some may randomly associate with. As many of you know, this movie was written by Reid and Roy's son, Jesse, and shot in the Andrews' former family home here in Pittsburgh. The father of the teenage protagonist is a professor who seems always to be lounging around the house. He wears dashikis and other vaguely ethnic clothing. He drinks mate. He tells stories about his time in the Amazon and shares various exotic South American foods, as well as his passion for the film Aguirre, the Wrath of God, protagonist and his friend Earl. This character is clearly not based on Reid, because this character is a sociologist, not a historian. Just that character. No, what I'm thinking of is Reid's verifiable appearance as a character in a critically acclaimed Argentine novel from 2008, Fiebre Negra, whose protagonist is a young female Argentine anthropologist in the early 2000s who begins to discover the Afro-Argentine past. One of her first stops is the National Library in Buenos Aires, where she tries to get her hands on everything that's been written on the subject. And Reid's book takes the prize and captures the heroine's imagination. It's a longish book, so bear with me. Book. I devoured Ortiz Poderigo, Rossi, Goldberg, Rodriguez Molas, Lanusa, and then I lingered on Andrews. I'm not quite sure why, perhaps because of his outsider's perspective or the absorbing way in which he told a story. The fact is, I read his book about Afro-Argentines from cover to cover. I went back to the first page. My eyes were burning. I closed them and let my forehead fall onto the desk, right on top of the book's dedication. I imagined I was Andrew's wife. The night of his life. It was a soothing thought. And to research Black people in Buenos Aires. I decided not to look into it, not to learn anything more about him, because I was sure that any biographical detail would shatter the sense of gratitude that had washed over me in that moment. This, someone tapped me on the shoulder. I took a second to regret being pulled out of my daydream. And yes, he claims such a distinction. Finally, Reid, should you have any doubt that your book will continue to be the foundational text for Afro-Argentine studies for at least another half-century or more, I'll close by citing my colleague, the anthropologist Alejandro, who captures the book's stature in this absolutely accurate, if characteristically salty, description. So excuse my language. Tell him not to worry. His book is still the effing Bible. I say it's the Old Testament and half of the New. Gracias, Reid.
So good to be back home with all of you. And for this occasion, of course, which is to celebrate one of the great scholars of Latin America of his generation, was somebody who has been a mentor, a collaborator, an accomplice, a role model, friend. But also to use this opportunity to reflect on the development of the field that we now call Afro-Latin American Studies. Reid himself wrote a recent text about the history of this field, which he published in the period as part of the Routledge Handbook on Afro-Latin American Studies. And it is everything he writes, it's a good piece. It's well done, it's properly documented, it's well explained, it's a solid piece of scholarship. But I have a tradition to uphold here. And that tradition that goes back 30 plus years orders me to somehow find a way to disagree. You see, when I was a student here, I would give Reid a really hard time. I would book his office hours. I would go in there to debate with him whatever on earth we were reading that week. And to, along the way, pretend I could teach him something about what we were reading. Among those conversations, endless conversations, I remember vividly very lively debates, conversations about the ideas of racial development, which were so hotly debated at the time in Brazil and here in the United States. As well, Reid had just made a critical contribution to those debates because he had just published the Blacks and Whites in Sao Paulo in 1991. I arrived here in 1992. I was very, very young at the time. Okay? And it was a conversation that happened in our history seminars, but it was a conversation that was already formed by scholars coming from other disciplines, from political science, sociology, anthropology, disciplines that were represented in his courses, in his reading courses. Somehow, my friend, you always found the patience, the generosity, the wisdom to transform my insolence into teaching moments, into warm and sincere invitations to articulate my own argument with rigor and clarity. Those are lessons, Reid, that I have always taken with me, and I have tried to be with students, with the many junior scholars who now work with me at the Afro-Latin Research Institute. This doesn't appear on your CV. But I think that in addition to excellence, which is of course all over your CV, the other term that defines your magnificent career, your intellectual work, and your pedagogy is generosity. Having said that, now let me disagree with you. There is a big problem with that piece. And if you do a search, a term search in that piece, which is a piece on the history of Afro-Latin American studies, Pitt doesn't appear, not even once. The University of Pittsburgh is not part of that story. And with that, my friend, I'm afraid I actually disagree. Okay, by the time Reid completed his PhD in 78 and came to Pittsburgh, 81, correct? What we now, well, he had just published the magnificent book that Paulina was talking about. The field that we now call Afro-Latin American Studies did not really exist. I mean, there was scholarship on race and slavery, particularly on slavery in Latin America, but there was nothing like a multidisciplinary field like we have today. In fact, the very year I arrived, Thomas Kimball, one of Reid's mentors at Wisconsin, published a paper lamenting the lack of scholarship concerning race in Latin America after the abolition of slavery, noting that most scholars in Latin America wrote about slavery, but then he said it is as if race disappeared with abolition, that it doesn't matter anymore. He mentioned one book in that paper published in 1982 as the exception, and that book was Reid's Blacks and Whites in South Paulo. By then, Reid was already in an intellectual journey. And that intellectual journey happened here at the University of Pittsburgh. That in many ways began to fill the vacuum that Kimball was talking about in 1992 when he published that paper. He had, of course, published a path-breaking book on Buenos Aires, which, as Paulina noted, did much more than correct the prevalent narrative for Argentina, for the Villa of Latin. But that book was an invitation to rethink Latin America. If you could write a book about race and about Afro-descendants in Argentina, of all places, what could be done in the rest of the region? In a review published in American Historical Review in 1981 by none other than Language Mourner, Brother Pitt connection there, he said he highlighted, I quote, the important implications of the book of the study of race relations far beyond the narrow confines in time and space. Those implications, of course, became fully visible with the publication of the book on this. Now, note what Reid had done. He had moved from a Spanish-speaking country to a Portuguese-speaking. He had moved from the 19th century to the 20th century to tell two different stories. And he had moved from the whitest, the nation imagined as whitest in Latin America, to the nation with the largest population of African descent. If that is not a map, you tell me what it is. That's what he had begun to do. Now, however noble it was, this was still a map charted from his own discipline. It was the map of a historian. But by the time I arrived at Pitt, same year that Kimball published a paper, that map was being enriched by colleagues in other disciplines, in other departments here. Sociology, there was Peggy Lovell, a sociologist who had graduated at the University of Florida in 1989 with a dissertation on racial inequality in the Brazilian labor market. There were other scholars who, even though they didn't work primarily in race, intersected with that agenda in various ways. I mean, then, for instance, American applied economist Carmen Salado, who was never a scholar of race, but who had published an important article on racial inequality. An article that became very useful to me. Talk about interlocutors in the Department of Literature. The very year I arrived, Beverly created the Latin American Subaltern Studies Group. Now, some of those conversations, John, don't get me wrong, were borderline incomprehensible. Any of the methodological, epistemological themes that Tony made and really connected very well with Latin American studies. And some of the students, I think Jamie, very closely with that group over the years. And of course, the political scientists, the two senior political scientists, Kimball and Michel, were also very interesting questions of democracy and equality. So this was a very fertile terrain for the field to somehow emerge, even though each of these colleagues worked, of course, in their own departments and in their own discipline. And then there were, of course, other characters in the history that were somehow connected with the field. Larry Glasgow was doing project for the US and Cuba. Rob was around. Marcus Rediker was around. He was not in the faculty. He always made himself available to all of us. So, in fact, for all practical purposes for us, he was in the faculty. Now, this is the terrain in which I think the field came. And that's why we need to rewrite that paper. I've waited 30 years to for the youngsters in the audience, you just have to be patient. It's good. It's good. You just have to wait for your turn, okay? Today I get to name it. Okay. So the centrality, of course, of Pitt in that process was consolidated with the publication of Latin America 1800-2000, which is, of course, really a magnificent synthesis. It's a historical synthesis. Like all of Reid's work is a synthesis that borrows heavily from in order to put that story together. Cultural studies, demography, anthropology, political science. It was the kind of synthesis that enabled us to imagine a multidisciplinary field, which up to that point, I don't think it's still existed. This is probably explains why around those years, I began to hear the expression, the Pitt School. The first person that mentioned that to me was Jose Moya, the historian from Columbia University. The Pitt School, indeed, the Pitt School. And at the center of that Pitt School, I'm Cuban, but this is not an exaggeration, my friend. You were at the center of that school. That school, Reid's magnificent synthesis, were still built mostly around history. But anyone who knows Reid's work and who had the good fortune of enduring and surviving his courses knows that always those courses were exposed to people from many other disciplines. And I think this is part of that, and not a minor part of that. That synthesis made it possible to imagine multidisciplinary groups of Latin American studies, like the Keila, a group of studios of Latin American who was invited, created in 2010, or the Afro-Latin American Research Institute that I created at Harvard in 2013. You know, when I created and that made it possible then to publish volumes like Afro-Latin American Studies, an introduction, which is a fully multidisciplinary volume, or to envision the Afro-Latin American series at Cambridge as a multidisciplinary series as well. That's why when I created the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at Harvard, the first thing I did was to invite Jorge to come faculty affiliate with the Alliance. Now, I'm not sure that invitation is the right term here. I remember calling him and asking him if he knew what he would be doing for the next few years of his academic life. You know, he could have told me to Michel at that point, of course, but instead he chuckled, which, you know, that awkward chuckle of him that he does when he doesn't know what to say. And again, found the generosity to ask me what was on my mind. And what was on my mind was to fully bring him into the life of the Institute. Now, this is not just a question of justice, although it is also a question of justice, which is so short in academia. But it's not just that. It is that I wanted all those junior schools, all those students from all over the world that came to Nállim every year, I wanted to know him personally, not you, him. I wanted them to have access to one truly foundational figure of this field and to experience the kind of generosity we experienced for so many years. Here is a student first of the field. Let me finish with this. Having put to rest the issue that I got it right and you need to write the story. In the acknowledgements in my 1996 dissertation, I wrote, quoting myself here, working and arguing with Andrews has been an exhilarating intellectual exercise. He questions many of my theoretical assumptions, but gave me the opportunity to challenge his, an opportunity that I regularly see. In the process, we have engaged in an endless discussion about class, race, and politics, which I hope will never end. When I got back, the text with his usual comments in that dreadful blue pen. You remember the blue pencils? You know, we had to look at the page, and depending on how much blue there was, I really worked more on this week or not. Well, he wrote in that blue pencil. It never will. So I want to finish by saying gracias for fulfilling that promise. Gracias for being there for all the years.
Thank you, Reid. Thank you, Reid. I am so happy to be here to celebrate your work and what I know will be your enduring place in public. I will start by saying that I became acquainted with Reid's work on Afro-Latin America by a kind of a detour. Because if memory serves me, I first got to know it as a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And if I'm remembering correctly, my initial encounter was not with the obvious. It wasn't with Reid's first two monographs on Argentina and Brazil, which were published respectively in 1980 and 1991. I'm pretty sure that it was Reid's 1995 co-edited volume on democracy that was my introduction to his work. That volume, The Social Construction of Democracy, 1870 to 1990, brings together case studies on various aspects of democratic politics in Europe, Latin America, Japan, and the United States. Looking back on that book today, in light of all the many things that Reid has written since, and the things he wrote before it was published, I think that although that book is quite different from his overall body of work, which of course centers clearly and comprehensively on Afro-Latin American history, the volume on democracy gives us a bird's eye view of Reid's interests, contributions, and ways of doing history. And I want to explain what I mean in 6 minutes. So first and foremost, the edited volume made clear early on that the question of democracy was central to Reid's work. And I think it has remained central to pretty much everything he has written since. By democracy, of course, Reid means something quite expansive, encompassing equality in all its ramifications, social, political, racial, and gender equality, to name a few. In looking at democracy in these many ways and from the perspective of Afro-Latin American history, Reid has been fundamentally attentive to Black agency. So, for example, in his chapter in the edited volume on democracy and in his 1991 book on Blacks and Whites in Brazil, Reid showed that new types of Black social movements emerged during Brazil's Cold War era dictatorship in the mid-1970s. And he argued that those movements played an important role in the gradual transition to democracy between 1978 and 1985. As I understand it, works on Latin America's democratic transition of the 1980s had completely overlooked that crucial fact and its deep significance. As Reid showed in the book on Brazil, the significance ran deep indeed, because Black movements that emerged during the dictatorship unmasked the enduring myths of racial democracy. That important point, in turn, connects with something that Reid stressed in his chapter in the volume on democracy. He highlighted there the problem of defining democracy in narrow terms. He pointed to the problem of emphasizing elections and policymaking exclusively without considering public debate about racial inequality spearheaded by Black activists, and without considering the impact of those debates on cultural, intellectual, and political life writ large. The edited volume on democracy thus confirms the centrality of democracy to Reid's work, in my view, and his expansive approach to it. And it also shows us, or alerts us to, its importance to his writing on Afro-Latin American history. The second point I want to make is that the volume on democracy showcases Reid's capacity for thinking new. It shows his interest in the international and the global. It also illustrates his talent for comparative and data-driven analysis. The introduction he co-authored begins and ends with Eastern Europe and Latin America, that is with Poland and Uruguay. Third, the edited volume illustrates Reid's investment in conceptual approaches, not just concerning questions of race and racism, which are, of course, fundamental to his writing. The edited volume also shows his investment in historical approaches to society and the state. Or today we might say social movements and the state, or political mobilization and political culture. Fourth, the volume shows Reid's affinity for collaborative work. And on that note, I will emphasize, when you read Reid's work, don't neglect the acknowledgements. I learned something very telling when I read the acknowledgements to the volume on democracy. I had known for quite some time that Pitt's history department was associated with broad initiatives in social history. But I had not known that those initiatives were spearheaded by Pittsburgh's Center for Social History, a joint endeavor of the history departments at Pitt and CMU. Nor had I known that that Center for Social History sponsored 4 distinct working groups, including one on the state and society. And I hadn't known that Reid had co-coordinated that group for many years. It was the working group on state and society that sponsored the conference leading to the edited volume on democracy. Fifth, the volume on democracy gives us an inkling of the expansive space that Reid's work covers. This is something that really stands out and is central to Reid's many contributions. What I mean is his capacity to cover, connect, and think concurrently about Brazil and Spanish America. That's quite unusual because the work of most US-based Latin Americanists centers on one. Reid's consistent effort to bring Brazil and Spanish America together in one frame, to cover the continent as a whole, is one of the things that makes his contributions to our understanding of Afro-Latin history and his contributions to our understanding of democracy and equality, as well as inequality, so important and so important. And on that note, I would add, sixth, that time is also in his work's favor. What I mean by that is that every single book that Reid has written covered 1, if not 2 centuries. One of the recent Afro-Latin America, Black Lives, covers 4 centuries. So Reid's writing consistently gives us the deep understanding that comes from expansive space and considerable chronological scope. I want to keep these contributions in mind as I go back to the first point that I made, that the edited volume showed early on that democracy is at the heart of it. Given Reid's interest in democracy writ large, it's not surprising that constitutions and censuses play a central role in his work. But I want to emphasize, I don't just mean, and he doesn't just mean, the result of censuses, and he doesn't just mean constitutions as finished documents. What I'm referring to is Reid's interest in the ways that censuses and constitutions get made and remade as a result of changes in states and societies and social movements. It's important to pay attention to the role of censuses and constitutions in Reid's work for many, many reasons, but I want to highlight two reasons. The first, concerning censuses. Has to do with their changing modes of data collection and the categories that they employ, which are central to the painstaking work that Reid has done to perceive and explain things that people had not seen. Because it was hard to see, or because the information wasn't being collected, or because it was being collected in particular ways. So first and foremost, among the things that he has sought to understand and explain via censuses is, of course, inequality. Second, Reid's attention to censuses and constitutions helps us see over time how his work has become more and more relational. What I mean by relational is in the sense that his work has increasingly situated African descendant and indigenous peoples in the same frame. That move probably has something to do with the changing nature of the field. It's a trend in recent and emerging scholarship. But I think that in Reid's case, it was driven above all by what was happening in the real. By real world, I mean the many faceted social movements of the 1990s and early 2000s, spearheaded by Black, Indigenous, and feminist organizations. That social mobilization in turn led to and shaped efforts to rewrite constitutions, sometimes in popular assemblies. It was also linked with changing norms of censuses and census making in the region, roughly in the same period. Most importantly, the data began to be collected not by imposition by census takers, by census, the subjects of censuses' own collection. In sum, Reid is a scholar whose academic work is rooted in political. So to sum up, with monographs on 3 distinct Latin American countries and many other books and articles of sweeping regional synthesis, Reid has contributed enormously to our understanding of Latin America's both great diversity and far-reaching commonality. And I think that perhaps above all, what he's shown us is that Afro-Latin America is all Latin. He's done that by looking widely and deeply, by both comparing and connecting. And by connecting, I mean that he's attentive to the ways that movements in one place borrow, learn, or take inspiration across borders. For example, Uruguay from Brazil. One final point I want to make, wrapped up in the others that I've already made about democracy, equality, agency, expansive space, and deep chronological scope. This last point is fundamental to Reid's academic impact, and it was apparent from the start in his first book, The Afro-Argentines in Buenos Aires. What I'm referring to is Reid's close and creative attention to dynamics of visibility and invisibility. That is to say, and I will conclude with these words, I think that at the heart of Reid's writing and at the heart of his academic impact is his capacity to see and listen for presence and voice in places where others before him had mistakenly perceived silence and absence. Thank you.
Thanks to the organizer and Reid for inviting me to this celebration. As an historian of international reputation, having published seminal works and paid remains of multiple generations of historians, I understand how meaningful this event is for my dear friend and thought partner. Nevertheless, to insert coherence with his personality and his scholarship, I must begin this presentation by referring to his acknowledgement in the groundbreaking book, Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires. In this work, he states, it is customary to list one's false last, often with an outward disclaimer that should be not taken to imply that there is in any way the least. Through these heartfelt words, Reid recognized the pivotal importance of his wife, the Royal Duena, in all stages of his group preparation, and accordingly placed her first in his acknowledgement. I'll do the same. My wife, Irene, could not join us today because of other professional meetings. When we discussed the upcoming trip, she said, I wish could come with you to celebrate Reid. I remember with Karim, founders, a group of young scholars at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, reading and debating his fascinating book, Afro-Latin America. When I met him in person, Greg said, at Brasa in 2018, in Rio de Janeiro, I was thrilled to discover that he was not only a brilliant scholar, but a remarkable human being. My wife Irene made that point. I conveyed this word. Yeah. This celebration primarily honored our Reid terminal contribution to history. However, while I wish I had pursued this path, I'm trained in economics of development and sociology. So I'm not an historian. This discipline has experienced tremendous advancement in methods and theories in the last decade. He is a key figure in his generation to transform historiographical studies and whose groundbreaking research introduced significant innovations to historiography and beyond. As a non-historian, I'd like to highlight the beyond, which means his influence over the social science field. Without intending exhausting the list, I will foreground 3 of them. Reid's first innovative contribution addressed the importance of the Black press in the study of the formation of consciousness regarding justice and racial identities among Afro-Latin population. In the Argentines of Buenos Aires, published in 1998, culminating his recent co-edited book, Voice of the Race, Black newspaper in Latin America. When I asked it to be encouraged to forget the previous contributions of Roger Bastide for this specific field of historiographical research, Reid asserts that what makes these papers uniquely valuable as a source material is the fact that they serve as a forum for the presentation of almost every viewpoint held by members of the community. They regularly printed letters from private individuals, as well as poems, social notice, and guest editorials. Contrasting with Bastide's approach, still featuring limitations coming from Levi Blue understanding of Afro-Brazilian lacunae to their pre-logical mindset, at least in the field of the social organization, in Reid's interpretation, the Black press was a memorable source of empirical studies because it voiced the actual Afro-Latin American leadership, aspiration, frustration, and litigation for racial justice, or in more straightforward words, their agents, free from any preconceptions and prejudice. The second significant contribution made by Reid's scholarship to the social science pertains to his crucial impact on the advancement of Afro-Latin studies, as mentioned here, since he previously mentioned a book on Afro-Argentines from Buenos Aires, published in 1980, and after in Uruguay. Here you can highlight Reid's pioneer insights when identifying the United States and Cuba as contrast models of racial integration, each one following a historical pathway under the capitalist affirmative action and socialist regime through the radical income distribution and universalization of social policy. However, in his pioneering studies in countries of the South America, our colleague also brought up another fundamental contribution to the literature. He overcame the traditional Brazil-centric, or more peripherally Cuban-centric, glimpse for the study of the patterns of racial formations in Latin America. So, by focusing in Argentina and the later Uruguay, Reid could find a particular nation-building model filtering the principle of a racist, no-segregationist whiteness, a topic mainly interesting when contraposed to the American trajectory in this field. So, without forgetting previous studies made by Martin Harris, Harold Hoyne, Pierre van der Berg, or Magnus Morley, once published in 1980, it is feasible to assume that Reid research on race formation in the County South launched the living stone for what is currently known as the Afro-Latin American field of study, which only could be created once it was consolidated the notion that this subject transcended the Brazilian or Cuban boundaries. Finally, Reid's scholarship represented a groundbreaking step in the literature with repercussions that extended well beyond the historiographical boundaries after he decided to roll up his sleeves and start studying Brazil in his no less fundamental Blacks and Whites in Naval. In his work, it's a country not only compelling and fascinating in its own rights, but a necessary stage in the journal of anyone interested in Black history, particularly Black history in Latin America. In this book, Reid boldly questioned Florestan Fernandes' interpretation of the inherited inability of the descendants of the enslaved population to compete with the white immigrants in the São Paulo factories, convincingly showing that neither Afro-Brazilians in that city at the time of the abolition were captives, nor all the European immigrants had the necessary skill to work as a proletariat in the most modern public laws. Nevertheless, Reid's research on racial formation in Brazil became one of his most distinguishable contributions to the current research in that nation and Latin America, when the scholar underlined the status of racial democracy and mestiçagem not only as a socio-cultural phenomenon, but as an axis of a broader discussion related to the country organization under the populist regime in the region. Grounded upon his research in Brazil, he identified the vibrant support of Afro-Brazilians gave to Varguista regime. In posterior contributions, Reid enlarged this discussion for several other Latin American nations, such as Peru and the Diaprianism, Colombia and the Gaetanism, Argentina and the Peronism, Cuba and the Castrism, identifying a common denominator among those different experiences centered around the idea that in all cases, the dark-skinned folks occupying a marginal position in the job market supported the national populist narrative decisively under the promise of social and the national integration regardless of people's skin color or ethnic origins. This finding is wonderfully developed in his no less seminal two versions of Afro-Latin America. Whether until the 1970s, the idea of racial democracy and mestiçagem were placed as subject to be acclaimed or denounced, theoretically, Reid visualized a shared pattern in crucial Latin American countries, linking problems of race, ethnicity, social class, and gender, and the new nation building that emerged from the collapse of the old liberal order in the 1920s and 1930s. Whereas those ideas are commonplace nowadays, that transformation as a theoretical paradigm is one of the most particular contributions given to Reid to the field of historiography and much beyond. I remember reading Afro-Latin America, 1800, 2000, at the beginning of the 2010 decades, and without flattering or overestimating, it is hard to describe the importance of those reflections over my own intellectual trajectory since then. My dear Reid, my dear friend, my dear Reid, I began this speech with my wife praising words about you, and I will wrap up this presentation by adding my own. If your books engraved my intellectual background, what made me a better human being was a chance to enjoy your kindness, good mood, and the ability to make everybody around you feel well received. It mirrors the old distinction between knowledge, which scholars in general carry, and wisdom, a particular quality that filters you. Now, you pay homage to a great historians. Still, our gathering around your names highlighted the traits that not only define the life of an out-of-serious human being, but they also help us to understand the deepest roots of his intellectual and academic achievements. Therefore, like someday you dream for the Afro-Uruguayans when leaving that country, I partially reproduce your words. May Iemanjá throw her enchanted wishes over your next steps with life, love, and happiness. To read from and with Paixão. Thanks so much. Muito obrigado. Agradeço.
Your smart insights and wonderful comments today. If everybody can please just stay seated, there is a surprise. We'll take a brief break for the next panel. Thanks so much for your attention.
Anybody who has read The Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires knows it has one major flaw. It is so good, it almost seems to close the conversation before it even begins. And for several years it did. Fortunately, a couple of decades ago, a new generation of Argentine scholars began picking up the many threads the book had left for exploration. Yet even today, nearly every paper on the subject continues to cite it, not out of academic habit, but because it remains essential. When we finally had the pleasure of welcoming George Reid Andrews to our Grupo de Estudios Afro-Latinoamericanos, Keila, at the University of Buenos Aires, it felt like meeting our totem, the mythical ancestor who had founded our academic lineage. Even better, we discovered that the man behind the foundational book was just as generous, kind, and inspiring as his work. The joy on our faces says it all.
Hola Reid, ¿cómo estás? Aquí de Buenos Aires, Argentina, te envío un abrazo y aprovecho la oportunidad para expresarte mi profundo agradecimiento y respeto por tu gran aporte al campo de estudios afroargentinos, donde lograste generar un verdadero cambio de paradigma. El libro Los Afroargentinos de Buenos Aires es un clásico en la temática, hay un consenso generalizado, no hay ningún tipo de discusión de que es una obra fundacional, pero también es una obra de lectura y de análisis indispensable en la actualidad. En lo personal, te quiero mostrar algo, que son dos libros tuyos de dos momentos diferentes. Uno es del año 1990, cuando acababa de salir la traducción al español, y el otro es un ejemplar que vos me enviaste luego de la reunión que realizamos acá en el GIALA, en el Instituto Ravignani, en el año 2014. Reunión que todavía recordamos con tanta emoción porque fue el encuentro más importante que nosotros tuvimos en el GIALA desde su creación en el 2010. Te muestro los dos libros para que veas que están todos señalizados porque hasta el día de hoy los consulto permanentemente. Estos libros muestran la vigencia de tu obra y también es un recuerdo de ese encuentro hermoso que ocurrió acá hace casi 11 años. Ahora que te vas a jubilar, esperamos que ese encuentro se pueda repetir. Vos sabes que siempre te estaremos esperando y también que siempre sos bienvenida. Ojalá sea pronto, Reid. Muchas gracias nuevamente por todo.
Hola, soy Lea Heller del Grupo de Estudios Afro-Latinoamericanos. Quería agradecerle a Paulina que me haya permitido estar, aunque sea con este videíto, en este homenaje tan necesario para el profesor Andrews. Desde aquí, desde Argentina, quienes trabajamos con historia afroargentina, con historia afro-latinoamericana, en este campo de estudios, no tenemos ninguna duda en afirmar una y otra vez que el profesor Andrews es quien ha permitido que se desarrolle este campo. Fue él quien revolucionó los estudios sobre afrodescendencia en Argentina. Fue él quien propuso que la población afroargentina no había desaparecido allá en la década de 1970, cuando aquí todo el mundo pensaba que éramos una población homogénea, blanca y europea. Él vino y dijo que no, que la población no había desaparecido, que la población afrodescendiente realmente estaba invisibilizada, y nos cambió la mira no hacia hipótesis que él fue demostrando una a una que eran falsas sobre esa desaparición, sino en mirar cómo se había construido nuestra propia nación. Gracias a eso tenemos ahora un campo de estudios que ha explotado, tenemos estudiantes, tenemos nuevas investigaciones, tenemos un futuro a la vista, y también ha explotado el activismo afroargentino que gracias a este cambio de paradigma que introdujo el profesor Andrews comenzó a revitalizarse y a tornarse de gran impacto en nuestra sociedad. El profesor Andrews escribió un libro que nosotros consideramos la Biblia. Cada vez que alguien entra a nuestro grupo de estudios al GEALA, le decimos lo primero que hay que hacer es leer el libro de Reid. Y así es como se ha forjado esta idea de que él es el padre de los estudios afroargentinos. Reid, te agradezco, te felicito, te tengo un cariño inmenso, un enorme agradecimiento, y espero que en los próximos años, más tranquilos, puedas viajar más seguido a Buenos Aires y continuar esta conversación.
Hola, Andrews. Bueno, un saludo muy afectuoso desde Buenos Aires. Soy Eva Lamborghini del GEALA y acá estoy con tu libro. Tu libro lo conseguí cuando estaba terminando mi formación de grado como antropóloga en la Universidad de Buenos Aires. Y desde entonces me sigue acompañando hasta el día de hoy. Te agradezco mucho por todo tu trabajo, por toda tu trayectoria. Y bueno, te deseo lo mejor para esta nueva etapa. Te mando un abrazo grande y brindo con un mate. Chin, chin.
Hola Reid, ¿cómo estás? Aquí Miriam Gómez desde Buenos Aires. Supe que te estás retirando, jubilando, y también quise participar de este saludo colectivo y decirte que aquel libro tuyo, entre muchos otros que escribiste, pero este en particular, Los afroargentinos de Buenos Aires, fue un texto que nos dio herramientas de análisis, datos históricos, estadísticos, que resultaron muy útiles para continuar el estudio de nuestras realidades. En mi caso particularmente, los análisis que realizaste de los censos coloniales fue realmente revelador para poder también encarar mi perspectiva acerca de la visibilidad estadística de los afroargentinos. Por todo esto, por tus aportes, tu seriedad, tu compromiso, desearte lo mejor en esta etapa que comienza, ¿no? Así que muchas felicidades. Gracias.
Hola Reid, ¿cómo estás? Te saluda Marilu Idoli desde Buenos Aires, y no quería estar ausente de este homenaje en este momento de tu retiro, así que quería agradecerte profundamente por tus investigaciones sobre los afroporteños, que fueron para mí, si bien yo leí el libro hace muchísimos años, en ese momento yo estaba cambiando de temática y fueron para mí todo un mundo nuevo que debo reconocer que desconocía. Y es un libro al que vuelvo de manera frecuente, muy frecuente, y cada vez que regreso a él encuentro nuevas puertas para abrir, nuevos hilos de los cuales tirar para seguir avanzando en mis propias investigaciones, así que eso es incomparable. Quiero decir, es incomparable, es tan importante que una investigación que fue hecha hace tanto tiempo tenga la vigencia que tiene, que siga siendo mencionada en montones de artículos. Así que bueno, te dejo un beso grande, espero que disfrutes de tu retiro, disfrútalo, que te lo mereces, y ojalá nos podamos ver en alguna oportunidad, así como nos vimos en Buenos Aires hace mucho tiempo también, Y gracias por todo. Un beso grande.
Hola a todas, a todes y a todos. Mi nombre es Marisol Fila, soy del GEALA, el Alari y la Universidad de Michigan. Querido Reid, muchísimas felicidades y muchísimas gracias. Gracias por tu trabajo riguroso, tu perspectiva comparada y tu dedicación. Gracias por establecer la fundación de los estudios afro-latinoamericanos y dar atención a espacios históricamente silenciados. Cada vez que tengo alguna duda o pregunta, recurro a tu trabajo, a tus libros, y allí están tus historias y las historias del pasado y del presente de voces afro-latinoamericanas. Espero que disfrutes muchísimo este tiempo a venir, que puedas aprovechar en familia, con amigues y seres queridos, y que sepas que tu trabajo siempre estará aquí con nosotros y seguirá estando para marcarnos el camino. Un abrazo grande y muchas gracias.
Bueno, es difícil exagerar la relevancia de la obra de George Reid Andrews para la historiografía argentina. Su trabajo fue pionero y abrió todo un campo en el que seguimos trabajando hoy, ¿no? Él relevó una cantidad de fuentes increíbles, realizó análisis agudos que nos mostraron e iluminaron, quizás desde Estados Unidos, puntos centrales y olvidados y negados de nuestra historia, ¿no? Forcluidos, y él nos mostró la relevancia de abordar ese pasado y su presente, ¿no? Y sus implicancias presentes. Y es un trabajo, ¿no? El de esta creación del campo de estudios afroargentinos específicamente, pero afro-latinoamericanos en general, que él ha realizado, que digamos es una contribución activa en movimiento, en la que continuamos, ¿no? Participando, beneficiándonos de toda la apuesta que hizo a este campo y a la necesidad de abordar estas temáticas: la diáspora africana, la esclavitud, la esclavización, ¿no? La abolición, la racialización, la continuidad de las desigualdades. Y el mensaje fundamental que tengo para darle es: muchas gracias, Reid. Muchas gracias por ese trabajo pionero, por esta apuesta y esta construcción de este campo, y mucha suerte en los nuevos caminos que inician, ¿no? Con este retiro, que no es un retiro de la discusión intelectual y de la sociabilidad entre pares, así que bueno, mucha suerte y que nos sigamos cruzando. Un abrazo.
Acá, desde Montevideo, Uruguay, Tomás Olivera Chirimini te envía un afectuoso saludo y felicitaciones por el merecido reconocimiento. Tu labor ha sido muy importante, tanto dentro de tu país como en el nuestro. Nos has señalado un camino a seguir para encontrar la realidad histórica, la verdadera realidad histórica. Realmente te felicito nuevamente por este merecido reconocimiento y te envío un gran saludo a ti y a tu hermosa familia, y espero que la vida nos dé la oportunidad de volver a reencontrarnos, ya sea acá o allá o donde sea, para estrechar y hacer realmente virtual, hacer efectivo este saludo que sale desde mi corazón.
Hola, Reid. Hi, Reid. This is Alex. I want to tell a story of more than 20 years ago. Reid was part of the support, and I would say financial support, to publish this book, Esclavitud y Trabajo, that Natalia, Estala, Carla Chagas, and I published in 2004. Now, there was no publisher in Uruguay who would publish this. With Natalia and Carla, we gathered money from the National Prize of History that we got out of that for the manuscript, but we still need a little bit of money to give the manuscript to a publisher to publish it, to a printer, actually, not to a publisher. Carla's husband, well, actually boyfriend, did the production of the book, the design at the time. And while we're trying to find funds in order to publish it, it was that we touched base with Reid. I'm talking about like 2002, 2003, something like that. And he volunteered some funds from either the Center of Latin American Studies in Pittsburgh or something like that. The funny part on all of this is that the printer, the print house, was the print house of the Anarchist Federation of Uruguay, which was like 10 blocks down the hill from the School of Humanities in Uruguay. So to make the payment to the printer, we actually brought Reid to the headquarters of the Federation of Anarchists in Uruguay in a print shop that, even for Uruguayan standards, where it was something, if you know what I mean. I cherish those years, and I cherish all these more than 20 years of support and exchanges that we have had with Reid and his love for Uruguay and for Latin America in general. Muchas gracias, Reid, te queremos. Vamos arriba.
Olá, eu sou Hebe Matos, professora da Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora e da Universidade Federal Fluminense, onde eu fiz toda a minha carreira acadêmica e onde eu conheci o Reid, Jorge Reid Andrews, há muitos anos atrás. O Reid é absolutamente fundador, né, da minha interlocução com o campo de pós-emancipação nas Américas. Nós estamos, é um orgulho enorme, um momento fundacional da minha carreira, a publicação do livro sobre o pós-emancipação no Brasil, com Rebecca Scott, Seymour Drescher, Roberto Levine e Jorge Reid Andrews, surgido de uma comunicação na LASA em 1988, né? É realmente um momento fundacional da minha carreira enquanto historiadora, mas também de abertura da minha reflexão sobre a questão do pós-emancipação e das desigualdades raciais e da história do racismo como um problema conectado, de história conectada nas Américas. E desde então, Reid para mim e Pittsburgh eram duas coisas conectadas, né? Pensar em Universidade de Pittsburgh era pensar em Jorge Reid Andrews, e a primeira vez que a minha querida parceira e amiga Keila Grinberg me convida para ir a Pittsburgh, e eu encontrei o Reid. Eu falei, agora eu estou em Pittsburgh porque eu encontrei Jorge Reid Andrews. Reid, muito obrigado por tudo que você nos permitiu aprender e refletir sobre o pós-emancipação nas Américas, não apenas na América Latina, no Brasil, mas como grande campo de reflexão. E você e a Universidade de Pittsburgh estarão para sempre, né, na minha reflexão sobre o tema, né? Vamos continuar conversando. Muito obrigada, amigo.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here today joining you in honor of Jorge Reid Andrews, this great historian and incredible person, to celebrate his legacy to Latin American history, Afro-Latin American history. And therefore, I would like also to invite you to know a little bit more about his work in life in this interview that has just been published in Mundos do Trabalho journal, Words of Labor journal. The link is here. The interview has been published in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. which shows the importance and the scope of his work for all of us. So, as we say in Portuguese, Viva Reid Andrews!
Dear Professor Andrews, my name is Mia Jodorowsky, and I'm an incoming PhD student in Afro-Argentine history this fall at Harvard. While we haven't met, we had a brief exchange over email a few months ago when I was looking for an advisor, and it was really nice to connect with you. Reading your seminal book on Afro-Argentines in Buenos Aires in the 19th century was a pivotal moment for me, one that opened so many more possibilities and questions that I will be dedicating, hopefully, my career to because of you. Wishing you all the best in this next chapter of your life, and I look forward to hopefully crossing paths with you in the near future.
Lara Putnam, I'm Reid's colleague in the history department. I heard that you've been here for 44 years. That is implausible, but equally plausible to me is that I've been here for half of that. I've been here for 22 years. And although there are many people in the room who have known Reid for longer than I have, I'm a little bit going to pull rank and say, if anyone has been on as many graduate dissertation committees and graduate lay paper committees with Reid as I have. I tried to do the math looking across the other colleagues in the room and comparing, I've been 26 at least dissertation committees and master's degree committees for students. It feels like a lot. I counted 26. And so I feel like, again, I'm going to pull rank a little bit here and say, I don't think anyone else actually knows how much time Reid has put into graduate mentoring, with the possible exception of Roy. Honestly, like kind of joke, even though it's very true. It's really profound in that, because it's not just, there's one of our colleagues here in economics talks about non-promotable labor, which is the kind of work that as an academic you should try to avoid. The work that lots of people need you to do, but won't actually show up on your CV in a way that makes it possible for you to be recognized and advanced. And graduate mentoring is not exactly that. Serving on a graduate committee or directing a dissertation, in some ways, is being recognized by a line on your CV, as you mentioned, who you've mentored. But not all faculty. Actually, that simple line of the CV doesn't really capture the intensity of interaction and the intensity of support that Reid gives to all of the students who I have been, privileged to watch him working with. Because it's not just about even the time that's spent, talking in graduate seminars or in his office. Kind of famously, Reid is, I think you've already heard about some long conversations that Alejandro would have with Reid, but probably everyone on this panel has a story to tell about Reid and his rocking chair. And you know that there's a point being debated when the rocking chair starts moving faster. In at least 26 and maybe more cases is not just that conversational work, but also the incredibly detailed work that Reid puts in to engaging with students' ideas on the paper. And that's where I know that Roy has seen him up late at night over the past 4 decades, working with, or up early in the morning, working on vacations, engaging with student work and giving students feedback on their written work and taking their ideas so seriously that he even chooses to disagree with them sometimes. And I was struck when Alejandro mentioned the Pitt school. On the one, never disagree with Alejandro de la Fuente either. On the one hand, I absolutely know what he's referring to, what he's capturing with him. But what's to me most striking when I look at Reid's work as a mentor is that every student here does not look like simply an extension of Reid's own interests or his own passions. He's been a mentor to students doing an incredible range of work on a range of topics with widely varying focuses, approaches, methodologies. But what he's brought to each and every one of those students is this incredible, passionate rigor for getting the work done right and for taking it seriously. And I found myself recently telling a graduate student as I was going through one of her drafts, I said, the sentence that you have here, I know it's the kind of sentence that books that we encourage you all to read include this kind of overly broad sentence all the time, and it's fine. But you have to cultivate that inner voice which says, what would Reid Andrews say of human rights? Student instantly knew what I was talking about. And I guess our job here at the University of Pittsburgh moving forward is going to be to cultivate that Reid Andrews inner voice in all of our students, even absent Reid's presence. So what you have here before you today is an incredible, just a sampling of the students who have been impacted by Reid's mentoring. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce them all super briefly to you, by which I mean super briefly. And we're just going in alphabetical order, which is not exactly the well, we'll go in the order of the program, which is alphabetical. Hold on one second, I'll have to give you introductions that include the names of their books, at least one of their recent books, if nothing else. So we'll start with Matthew Casey. Matthew Casey, who is currently, I think, director of the School of Humanities at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he's professor of history. He's the author of Empire's Guest Workers, Haitian Migrants in Cuba During the Age of U.S. Occupation. We'll then hear from Sharika Crawford, who is the Speedwell Professor of International Studies at the United States Naval Academy and the author of The Last Turtlemen of the Caribbean, Waterscapes of Labor, Conservation, and Boundary Making. We'll then hear from Tasha Kimball, who's Associate Professor of History at the College of Staten Island, CUNY, and author of An Open Secret, The History of Unwanted Pregnancy and Abortion in Modern Bolivia. We'll hear from Betsy Konefal, who is Associate Professor of History at the College of William and Mary, and author of For Every Indio Who Falls, A History of Maya Activism in Guatemala, 1960 to 1990. We'll hear then from Jorge Nállim, who's Professor of History at the University of Manitoba and author of Transformations and Crisis of Liberalism in Argentina, 1930 to 1955. We'll hear from James Sanders, who is Professor and Director of Graduate Studies at Utah State University and author of, most recently, The Vanguard of the Atlantic World, Creating Modernity, Nation, and Democracy in 19th Century Latin America. We'll hear from Oscar de la Torre, Associate Professor of Africana Studies at UNC-Charlotte and author of The People of the River, Nature and Identity in Black Amazonia, 1835 to 1945. And we'll hear from Victor Uribe, Professor of History at Florida International University and author of, among many other things, Fatal Love, Spousal Homicide, Law and Punishment in the Late Colonial Spanish Atlantic. And just that range of titles, I think, gives you a sense of what I was thinking. They say is that Reid has managed to mentor an extraordinary range of excellence among his students. So let's start with Matt Casey here.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can y'all hear me all right? Yeah, I am. So I was at Pitt from 2004 to 2012, and actually my advisor was Alejandro, and Reid and Lara were on my committee as well with Jerome Branch. So I was one of those 26, probably 14th or 15th, I would guess. And I think part of my success at Pitt was when I learned how to interact with all the people on my committee and to really lean into everyone's expertise. So when I was thinking about Reid and mentorship, the first thing I wrote down was the blue pencil. And so for me, it was a pencil. Maybe the pen ran out of ink on Alejandro's dissertation. But Reid had writing these really short, very straightforward questions. And I would liken them to Zen riddles or sayings, except and it was just so crisp, and it would send me kind of on this journey, really trying to work through the questions he was asking. And then usually my ending point was back to the question and his starting point. And that was incredibly productive. what I realized is he was not just teaching me to sort of think and write like a historian, he was also teaching me how to mentor future historians and students. And in fact, I think I had more grad seminars with Reid than anyone else. And to this day, and I actually don't know why, but to this day, I start every grad seminar, it's kind of an invocation of Reid, and I say, how'd it go? And I don't know if he still does it. It is very interesting. And sometimes I'll think who this person was and why I do this thing. But in South Mississippi, do you read? Where as I've wrestled, especially trying to write, and especially trying to write about race in Latin America, where I think I have to go back to those grad seminars because we were asking really big questions. The scholarship has progressed and moved along, but that is always that is my drawing board, and that is going back to my roots and trying to figure out what would this look like in this seminar. And in fact, within the last year, I remember finishing the draft of a just kind of difficult to write chapter and thinking, this is kind of a love letter to that race in Latin America class that I wrote. So if the book comes out, I got to stop being the department chair first, but if the book ever comes out, then I'll mention that in the acknowledgement. But there's something very rooted about the experience here. One of the things, though, too, is if you work really hard, which we did, you also get to be kind of silly sometimes, right? And so, like, there was room in the cracks, in the hallway, and in the office conversations for humor and joy and laughter and conversations about music. And those also were formative in their own way. And I remember being a very earnest first semester graduate student, you know, asking Reid about some kind of piece of paperwork, and he was cool as a cucumber, sitting in the rocking chair, and we were not going to talk about this form, and he was like, I'm going ice skating later tonight. Because apparently there's some canal that freezes over, and then you can skate for a long time, and that was like a really big deal for Reid. And I remember this really profound lesson, which was, look at how smart and productive this man is. And he's interested in ice skating. And his office is really clean. And I thought, okay, I need to maybe model some of these things. Clean office, no, but everything else. And so we all know that when Reid thinks something's funny, he gets all fidgety, and he curls up his shoulders, and fuckers, he's doing it. And we also know that during graduate seminars, and I asked Sharika if I could do this in advance. You knew if you sit next to Reid, you were in the elbow zone. From Reid, you're in the eye contact. You get called even if you didn't raise your hand. So thanks, Reid, for teaching me how to teach and also teaching me how to be a historian. But thank you also for showing that you can be a cutting-edge, path-breaking scholar and you can bring people with you. That you can be brilliant, but also fun and have a tidy office, and that you can hold people to the absolute highest standards of intellectual accomplishment, and you can still be really nice. And so if everyone is saying all these same things over and over again, and yet we're not saying them enough. And I really appreciate you, and in this odd way, your kind of legacy lives on in my grad seminars in South Mississippi. So thank you, Reid.
I think I'm stealing a page from Paulina in both my sort of structure of my comments. I wanted to sort of marry my own sort of journey as a historian linked up to Reid, and I may get off topic a little bit and share a couple of additional memories that I have. When people have asked me about my graduate training, or more specifically how I got to become a historian, I always start immediately and ironically by mentioning Reid Andrews.
long before I ever stepped foot at Pitt or even seriously thought about a career as a professional historian, his book, The Afro-Argentines of Buenos Aires, lit a fire in me, led me down this intellectual journey of wanting to be a historian of the experience of African people in Latin America. At the time, I was a freshman at Michigan State, studying international relations when I first picked up this book, and I couldn't put it down. I read it again and again throughout my undergrad years, eager to learn anything I could on the Huella Africana or the African footprint in Latin America. I was kind of like Paulina's story of the man who worked at Penn or Mark, right? And, just kept reading and reading. So you can imagine my thrill years later, while I was living in Bogota on a Fulbright grant, when I got a call from Reid himself. He was reaching out to me. He was hoping that I would accept the offer to attend Pitt's graduate program and to work with him, or even Alejandro. At the time, it wasn't quite clear which direction I was going to go. I thought I was going to work on Brazil, but maybe Cuba. Wasn't quite sure. It felt fated, looking back. Now, I should be honest, to some degree, I came with fairly good preparation. I had good, strong language skills. I did a multidisciplinary, program in Latin American studies at UCLA. But I'll admit it, I was still a work in progress in terms of becoming a historian. Looking back, I can really appreciate his patience, and I think Alejandro mentioned that as well. He was steady, supportive, mentoring me. He made me feel like, my ideas really mattered on many topics, both what was right in front of us, in terms of the reading list that we had, but all kinds of things he was just curious about. Let me just give you a few quick examples. When I said Reid was patient, I had these ideas, some of which were, sophisticated, some of them were rough, and we met one-on-one during my year at Pitt. I arrived in 2002. I was the single Latin American history student of my cohort. So Matt came, two years later, and Betsy was there, and I just missed Jamie. Jamie was finishing up, right? And so we had these one-on-one tutorials, and in those particular tutorials, we would have to kind of go back and forth. We were reading material, I was writing, and he was always offering thoughtful, rigorous feedback and sharing lots of resources to help me grow. I have memory of the blue pencil, and I still have those particular papers. I've kept them. For reasons that are good to show students that this is a journey, it's a process, and where you may start may not be where you end. But I do have them, and I do remember them. I also still remember something that Reid had to share with me more than one occasion, and maybe some of you remember this. I think he was quoting William Zisner, "Clear thinking becomes clear writing, and one cannot exist without the other." So we would have these great conversations, and I would be fired up, and I would be ready, and he was like, "Great, write it down." We'll come back right after, you see what's next. I have to thank you, Reid, for being such a great listener, and for modeling what I appreciate, and I think Matt just mentioned, which was sort of this genuine sense of curiosity and interest in your students. Lara mentioned this at the start. Anyone who knows Reid, we talked about him sitting in his rocking chair, knowing exactly when he might slap his hand on the knee, or his hands might wave in the air in response to something you said, something maybe that he hadn't thought about, or something that was, that caught him off guard, or he wanted to explore further. And I really appreciated that you often just simply ask questions. Why? How come? You usually were prompting me, and I imagine many other students, right, to kind of clarify their own thoughts. In fact, I just witnessed this. Reid and I saw each other in January at AHA in New York, and he was seated across from me near a colleague and a good friend. And he sat there, and he literally nodded, and he asked a lot of questions, right? But he was engaged. You felt that one-on-one. And I have to say that I hadn't had those kinds of dialogues with my professors before arriving to Pitt. So it was something now that I can look back on and know that that was very special. That was not kind of the norm. It wasn't the norm to have that sort of engagement. I also have so many professional memories in terms of how he helped to model in very practical ways what it means to be a historian. I remember my first graduate conference, the Mid-Atlantic Council on Latin American Studies, and we took a drive to Kutztown, Pennsylvania. Spent a lot of time to chat with one another and arrive to this, kind of small regional, state college. And it was a very small conference. And I think there was like 4 people. But he was there, supportive, guiding. And then I was able to see actually him present in a way that's masterful. It's just, it rolls off the tongue and it's so very natural to him. But I remembered that and it stayed with me. I also remember where his patience and generosity came to bear when I had to take the Portuguese translation exam 3 different times. One was for a technical reason, I just didn't complete the second time, I think it wasn't that great. And then the third time, so finally we've gotten this right? So that patience, and never did I feel, slighted or, meant to feel bad. That was just how it was. But honestly, what I can say is that the most fundamental parts of who I am professionally, I have been able to benefit from your shaping of me as a historian, and I thank you. Gracias. From the bottom of my heart.
I feel like I'm going to be a bit of a broken record because we've all had this same advisor, right? This same remarkable human being. I came in a little bit after Matt, so I arrived in 2006 and left in 2013. Successfully, I got a job. And, yeah, I do have to mention probably. And when we were registering for this conference, there's a little space for us to leave a comment for Reid. And there was some confusion among us. Did we register as well? So I did this last minute yesterday, and the first thing that came to my mind is working with Reid made me a better thinker, scholar, and those 3 things in overlapping ways and infused both through work and through our interactions. And as other people have mentioned, for me, it had so much to do, not just with the way that Reid interacted with me, but the way that he modeled teaching and writing and listening, as was mentioned. I was thinking about what Sharika was saying about being such a fantastic listener. And that's something that I benefited from and experienced as well. And I would say that for me personally, those sorts of in-depth interactions were things that I not only hadn't experienced with a professor, but I hadn't experienced with that many people in my life. So it really taught me how to be that person to others. I too had my experiences with the blue pencil. One of the things that I loved about working with Reid is that he was so present with me and so patient that when we would be going over a draft together of my work, he would frequently hold up the finger, turn around and get the dictionary. The definition of the word that I had chosen, say, is that what you meant to do? And just like these other folks mentioned, I do that with my students because it's sort of like demonstrating a faith that I know you can do all those things. And I'm just tremendously grateful for it. One thing I thought was really important to mention is Reid's humility as well. So I came into the program with no history background at all. I had a lot of dreams about what I wanted to do and no sense that I actually needed sources to be able to
And when I sort of started thinking about my interests and really got down to it, I realized that what mattered to me most were human stories, personal stories. So I'm an oral historian. And Reid didn't have a ton of experience with that. You know, I was going to be talking with women about their experiences with unwanted pregnancy and abortion. So I was going to be addressing a lot to do with gender, to sources. And Reid would always tell me the limits of his experience and encourage me to reach out. To Lara was a huge part of my experience, and also Kathleen Lee, who had worked a lot with oral testimony. And so, you know, that we've sort of, I think it was mentioned in the previous panel as well, of just, and Lara said this, right? That we're not extensions of Reid. He is able to help us look at what we have, what our interests are, what makes us feel passionate, you know, about what we do, and help to develop that. So that piece was really important. And then the human piece, right? This is an incredibly difficult profession, as a lot of people know, in terms of trying to achieve, or even recognizing that it's important to have any sense of work. And I remember one of my first conversations with, as an advisee, he asked me what I did in my personal life, you know, beyond reading and writing. And I mentioned that I was into exercise. I taught capoeira at this university. He was actually our sort of faculty advisor for our student group of capoeira. And I remember him saying, that's good that you're into exercise, because graduate school is very intense in a very sedentary way. And that's very true. But I would think, you know, Reid and I at least a quarter of the time in our conversations, we were talking about exercise. I joined a rowing team. Just having that be emphasized, having that be something, you know, that I should also put a lot of thought into, not only what type of job I wanted, but where I wanted to live, what I wanted my life to look like. I ended up leaving Pitt and getting my first job at a college in central New York for a one-year position. But in order to get to take that job, I turned down an on-campus interview for a tenure stream job in Central Texas. And Reid was very pragmatic about it. He told me the pros and the cons, and told me, you know, ultimately you have to follow your heart and choose the path that you think you're going to be able to really live with. You know, this is not just about work. So I can't say enough good things about you. I love you dearly, and I feel so grateful to have gotten to work with you. And yeah, in good company. Thank you.
Reid, can you fix it?
Thank you. So like Tasha, I took an unusual route to a history PhD. I was studying international relations and human rights. Not every advisor would have this, I think. I was interested in very, very current things, current social conflicts, problems of rights and justice that were very much ongoing and unsettled. You know, these terrible histories sort of literally led into the present. And I will always be grateful to how open to all of that. Honestly, open to taking my graduate student who barely studied history. Someone who chose to focus not on Mexico, Argentina, or Brazil, but on the very tiny and beautiful and sometimes tragic country of Guatemala. Reid absolutely stands out for being open to sharing his expertise on race, but also thinking about how Indigenous people and communities might experience racialization or organize around identity very differently. So one of my very best experiences at graduate school was with and Alejandro Fuente, both agreed to do a joint independent study with me on comparative race and ethnicity. So the three of us in the room agreed with the two of us. It was like trying to make sense of it all. But years later, I was able to turn that project into a class, which is just a joy to teach. Sometimes, like everyone else here, sometimes I dig out those notes, the discussions that we had between the three of us. It's been probably not to recognize how, I guess that would probably, so comps preparation, that's sort of caliber is their foundation. So thank you. When it came to dissertation research, Reid was the advisor who did absolutely everything to keep that process moving forward. Just relentlessly moving forward. I absolutely haunted to this day by the word onward. He often requested that I could find my way over and over and see something. So he did not try to redirect me with his intent to examine the history of the higher revolutionaries. He didn't seem to worry that history is almost completely distinct, almost unspeakable, this political taboo, sometimes probably dangerous, in that very unsettled sort of early 2000s. I don't know, I felt completely free to travel the Highlands, to knock on doors, collecting these local histories of activism. When I planned what to say today, I realized now that he actually was doing it. If my students were doing that, I would feel over it. But he never ever discouraged me from doing it, and I just appreciate it so much. Actually, I do remember one time I seemed to stun him. I don't know what we were talking about. One of my clearest memories of being in his office was when, I don't know, I suggested something so unexpected, maybe a little outrageous, that he not only was working in the rocking chair, but he stopped midway. He sort of stayed there, just like balancing on the. But then, as always, he just decided to go with it. Resume rocking. He supported me in whatever it was I wanted to do. And basically put up with every crazy thing. Even college decisions. So it's a fantastic idea to have 3 children. Anyway, thank you very much, Reid. I really got how influential these years of work here. I assign your writings at dear students that would be very partly because of content and partly so they understand sort of my journey too. So you remain with us. Just recently, in January, I took a group of students to Argentina and we stumbled on a drumming group. And all I could think of when I saw this drumming group was the image of Reid like drumming alongside the drumming group, I think in where I am sure. But anyway, just yeah. Just obviously passionately and fully engaged with not only the subjects we study, but the people. That's a legacy that will live on and with all of us. So thank you, and she's been very happy.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a really happy occasion. I'm so glad to be here. This is like a feast, it's the best way to end the semester. It's a light in a dark world, really here for you, and especially for this occasion. So a lot of things that have been said, I cannot just say enough because I have all those memories, happy memories. What comes to my mind first of all is the commitment and the dedication of Reid to his students. My fellow colleagues have said, in teaching, for example, in the teaching, the approach to teaching, still my students, when they take my colonial Latin American, sometimes walk through the streets of Potosí in the 17th century with Bartolomé de Arzán, they don't know where that is coming from, right? So when they ask me, when I say to them that I practice kind of Socratic terrorism in my seminars, they don't know what is it. Well, I remember it. What do you think of that? People would be like that. But in a way, this is good. I always tell my students, this is good. You can say something, just say something. Right? But in terms of commitment, I think the main point for me was the work in the dissertation, which we all know is very lonely. We sit, we go to research, and then we sit with our heads full of ideas, all that. And again, write it down. Well, this is important, blah, 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 but write it down, explain why it's relevant. So those questions are still important. And I had better memories than the blue pen. In my case, because I'm a native Spanish speaker, so I came the first draft of my first chapter, which was like 120 pages. I was so proud because I got so much information. We like take the chapter, so you can imagine. I was so proud because I had got so much information. So Reid took it, okay, and then we met in the office. The first thing he said, I remember to this day, is, well, your English is not bad, but it's not totally good. In Spanish, your English. Okay. And then what he did is something extraordinary. He worked with me. He picked up the draft. I was not blue, it was red. It was red. This is how bad it was. It was scribbled, all page after page. And he said, we are going to work. I want to read with you all this. So for you to see what are your mistakes, because it's not only grammar, it's the social linguistics that you don't see as non-native speakers, right? So he started with me patiently, not just the dictionary. Why this is not right? Why this is not good? I kept that list for years. Because it shows for me that kind of commitment to improvement, to do the best that you can do. So the grammar handbook was one of, for me, captures that kind of thing. Then it goes into the support that Reid gave me through migration. I was a Fulbright scholar here, but then we went when Fulbright expired. If you have been an international student, Victor, you might know this, I don't know. But the J1 visa expired. We had to move to the teaching fellowship. These were the post 9/11 years. Everything was complicated. I needed all the support to sign forms and all that. And Reid was there relentlessly. So every time making sure that the signatures were there. When I was here, when I went to Sarah Lawrence College, all the time, Reid, I need this, and Reid, we do that. And it was a lot of time and a lot of support, right, in that sense. So I truly appreciate that. Reid gave me work during the summers also, as some of you know, at least in those days, the teaching fellowship lasted for 8 months, and then you were on your own. And you're international students. Where do you go? What do you do? So Shirley rescued me for work at the Center for Latin American Studies one time, and Reid gave me to do research, on Dominican Republic, Brazil, Colombia, all sorts of things, newspapers in the early days of the internet, about what was published in those newspapers. Right? It was an exhilarating experience, but also another proof of his support, for the students, in those difficult circumstances, right? So that was quite something. I have those on memory about his dedication, his guidance, his commitment, his moral compass, because he was always very clear about this is what you need to do, this is how you need to get there. I remember at some point I needed to finish my dissertation to begin that year that I got here as visiting professor. And I remember we were in the writing process. Well, you need to finish. it's August and you need to do it because September, late August, you need to be there. I said, yeah. I don't know how I did it. I did it. I finished in August. I defended that. And I can see also the mentoring in terms of even finding the thread for my dissertation. I remember after I finished my master's here, I had no idea really where I wanted to go. So we did a reading seminar, basically. I said, well, you're interested in Argentine history, so let's read. We put together a list of readings. Let's read about Argentine history and see what's your thread. What do you find? What is the question for you? What is the question for your dissertation? And that was it. So we spent a full month reading Argentine history, all sorts of things, and it kept coming to my mind. Why everyone is talking about the hegemony of liberalism in the 19th century and then the crisis of liberalism after 1930? What happened to liberalism? Everyone was talking about crisis. And that was my dissertation. That was the question, the history of liberalism in Argentina from 1930 to 1946. And then eventually it came my boom. And from them, I went to all war liberalism, anti-fascism, and so on. So to these days, those 23 years now, since I defended my dissertation, your legacy lives on in that question. What do you want to do? Why is it relevant? How do you want to? And the writing, how to write clearly without jargon that people can understand and be clear about that. So those were lessons that I take with me to this day. And obviously we have shared other experiences with Reid, a memorable trip to Buenos Aires in 2000 to the conference in San Andres, when from there you got to the Uruguayan book for that, 2000. And then, for those of you who know, Reid also went to Manitoba in 2010 with Roy. He has a fame there from this guest scholar who not only traveled to Manitoba to Winnipeg in the winter, but more so, they went snowshoeing at night in minus 40. And not only that, the next day they went ice skating in the rain. He has this fame of that guest scholar who really came and did the Manitoban way. You have very fun friends over there. So, so I could go on and on. There are so many things I could say. But I just want to finish because we are so many here. I want to leave more space. In June, I will be getting out a book with a colleague, Sandra McGee-Deutsch, on the history of anti-fascism. It's in Latin America. It's published by Cambridge and all that. It's a co-edited volume. We're very proud. We never thought that it was going to be so important in the current days. Made a memory of the 1930s, 40s, and beyond, enlightenment, in this different moment. But what I want to say is not about self-promotion, is that each of us standing, and I will write our acknowledgement. And my acknowledgement reads to Jorge Luis Andrews, exemplary advisor, outstanding colleague, and loyal friend, without whom neither this book nor my career would have been. Thank you.
It actually took me a surprisingly long time not to call him Dr. Andrews, years and years, but I'll try to super brief. I first met Reid at a conference at the University of Florida, which he'd come down to, and I was just a student then. And just the interest and kindness he showed in telling you had no idea, with an accent that probably was semi-incomprehensible to him at the time, was what sort of drew me to come to the University of Pittsburgh and how I ended up here. Reid also taught the very first class I took here. Alejandro was in it, and it was Faith Society in Latin America. And I can't emphasize enough how great this class was and how much we heard people speakers in that exact same situation. It was a class about big ideas, about how societies work, about why large-scale change happens, Big problems that sometimes today historians are afraid to address. And even 30 years later, this course still influences how I think. I think about it time and time as I'm writing something or as I'm teaching something. Of course, as we heard in the wonderful previous session, I took all these lessons, not just from these classes, but from these back work, from books. I work on race and on these books on information society. So I had a lot to read thinking about how race is creating, negotiating, listed. But I really think it goes beyond that. His work as a whole provides a model, at least for me, about how to capture the complexity of the past, which a lot of historians can do, but also explain that complexity in a way that gives meaning to the past. And that's what not so many people do. So I'm trying to keep that in mind whenever I write those lessons. When I came here, like a lot of young academics, I was pretty good at bullshitting. Heard a lot about the rocking chairs as one could be expected, but it also was a seismograph for that. About again how when you're thinking smart, the chair's rocking faster. But when you're saying something that is very slow and mentioned, the problem is when when you are talking, the chair's rocking faster, but you really want stuff. And then all of a sudden it just that made you feel I learned this years later after long gone from Pitt. I submitted an article for the new project I was working on to a journal. It got rejected right away. And I sent it to Reid, not because of anything he was interested in working on. Again, I've been read we all know. But I needed to know if I actually had something here or not. And I could send it to a lot of other people. I suspect they would say, oh yeah, this is great. I need someone I could trust. And Reid read it and said, yeah, you have something here. And that gave me the confidence to go on, and it became my second book. He is certainly the finest improver of student writing I've ever met. As he never just criticizes something, and he never just hands out the useless, this is fine, this is good enough. That's dead. But demonstrate to students how they can take what they have and transform it into something with more clarity, more argument. Like Matthew with panel, Reid was not actually my advisor. He was on my committee. Sometimes Reid has pointed this out when we're on conference panels together, and I worry it's because he doesn't want to take the blame. But really, it's to acknowledge that Michel Jimenez was my advisor. He was on the committee, and he and my collection a perfect combination. You'd have Reid something. Unless he's got frustrated, because often their comments would come back and they'd say the exact opposite things. But if you learn how to combine those two approaches, that's really where you go. Michael goes, get this, get here, get there. And there's always hope. Here's what you need to do to make this publishable. Here's what you need to do to make a contribution. This doesn't work yet. Here's what you need to do to make that work. And again, if you're trying to finish a dissertation, this is the best thing that you can have. I treated Reid like a co-advisor, and he acted as such. Reid drafts every chapter as I wrote them. I give him copious, but always very precise advice with a blue pencil. And always about again what I need to do to get this finished and to make it better. At the time, I thought this was normal, and I thought nothing of it. And as Laura hinted at, that as years passed, as a professor myself, I realized what a huge imposition this was. We could have easily just said, my your advisor, give me the thing at the end, I'll read it, give you comments. But just the time he spent improving this work from day one until the end, it shows just the care that we always gave and always dedicated to the student. And that is something that I think none of us here will forget.
Hello, everybody. 20 years ago, when I first arrived in Pittsburgh, Reid was up there, not only because of his academic prestige, but because he was actually, he had climbed a ladder that day and he was painting his house. That was an interesting first experience. The second one was realizing that Clint Eastwood looks after you. So I thought, oh my gosh, my advisor is Clint Eastwood, looks like Clint Eastwood. How is that experience going? And then that continued to be an interesting experience because I remember that at that time, I think you played right? Okay, right. And you have super strong handshake. I didn't yell, but that was it was like a little bit of things to come. Bueno, like we call it, I remember all the seminars with a lot of love because that was a great time. That was truly the place where you pushed us to grow intellectually and to develop the capacity of engaging with complex ideas and be there, right? Always with rigor, always helping us as well, but always with rigor, right? And that was something that I truly admired, found you. Now, I was also a TA for you in one class, I think Modern Latin America. And so I was also, I also learned many things in that class about teaching that I have tried to apply in later years. For example, Reid, when he was lecturing in the classroom with undergrads, had a very theatrical way of lecturing in the sense that he interprets, right? And therefore, that allows the students and helps the students remain engaged and paying attention and all of that. No? He was also, I think, a really good picker of materials for those classes. I remember, thank you, but I remember, for example, the first time when I saw you pick this Brazilian novel, Gabriela Canela, for a Modern Latin America class, and I thought, what a good choice, right? A novel that works so well in a history class. And then Reid was also very generous in the classroom because he put a lot of himself when he was lecturing and teaching. I saw him one day discussing the military dictatorship in Argentina and how the military junta had kidnapped many young students and activists. And he got a little moved when he was lecturing about that because he explained to the students that the age of the persons that were kidnapped at the time was not that far from the same students he was lecturing. To me, that was another lesson, a lesson in generosity when it came to teaching. Perhaps, many of us here have already discussed aspects of your teaching that were truly inspirational. But I would simply like to say that to me, the most educational thing you always did is teaching by example. That is what to me synthesized all that we learned from you by you taught us in grad seminars by being a rigorous professor, right? And by pushing us to think and by helping us along the way. But that teaching by example, I think, is the most inspirational thing that one can do. So thank you, Reid, for everything.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to know that this was organized alphabetically. I thought it was by age. But I have to know that it's because I included it. Anyway, thank you, Professor Grinberg, for inviting me to be in this very meaningful event. I probably am the person here who met with the longest time. I met Reid nearly 40 years ago. And in case you are curious, at the time he was 20 and I was 15. We were both very precocious. Age aside, I had the great fortune to take an advanced open course in U.S. On the history of U.S. Latin American foreign relations that was held in a small intimate room in the Cathedral of Learning. This class, in which a few graduate students were required to do extra work for credit, was one of the highlights of my academic journey, because in fact, it was the reason I decided not to continue PhD in political science, but to switch majors and become a historian. I was also fortunate enough to participate later in two of Reid's graduate seminars on Latin American history of society relations. They met in the department's main seminar room, and they were filled with passionate Latin Americanists. And there I read some of the classics. Reid was always on the big books, and I read Carlos Gonzaleto, Florencia Malon, Steve Stern, Nora Hamilton, Guillermo O'Donnell, and so on and so forth. It was really a very informative experience. I'm not certain if I served as his teaching assistant for a survey of colonial Latin American history, or I simply asked permission to sit in on the course. But I distinctly remember attending these wonderful dynamic lectures in a large auditorium here in this building that was named at the time the fourth squadron. It wasn't the Oscar Hall, it was the fourth squadron, if I recall correctly. This has been a stadium, baseball stadium in the past. Among the readings for that class were notable works that I learned a great deal from, and I use regularly in my future classes, such as Colonial Heritage of Latin America by Steins, R.T. Patton's The Hummingbird and the Hawk, the Tales of Policy that were mentioned before. Anyway, those were very important readings in my training. However, the most significant and life-changing experience was having Reid supervised my doctoral dissertation. He was then an up-and-coming young scholar. He had published the Afro-Argentines a few years earlier, and was on the verge of releasing his Blacks and Whites in Sao Paulo. Although my primary research interest didn't align with the subjects was becoming known for and what he interested in, he was generous enough to accept directing a boring dissertation on the history of lawyers and politics in Colombia. And I was very grateful, and his mentorship profoundly shaped my thinking and academic career. I vividly recall visiting Reid in his office in post-squadron here in this building. In the early 90s, he was often seated in the rocking chair that has been mentioned here, which he would occasionally rock back and forth. And in my experience, the rocking became more pronounced as I submitted chapters of my dissertation, but it wasn't because I was onto something. It was, I think, the only way he could cope with the tension that he felt over the quality of my writing, both my prose and analysis. And why in it. In any case, I was lucky enough that, if I am correct, I was his first graduate student, and therefore he indulged me and ended up editing extensively my English prose, for which I will remain forever grateful. I would have otherwise had to pay for an editor, and I didn't have that. Reid was not only a great mentor, but a great editor. Without his editing, I would have not made anything of course. On one occasion, I apologized to him for the strain that my work had posed him, and his reply was that one day I would find myself in the same position with my own students. As much as I hoped he was wrong, I now understand how right he was. This very day, I continued to edit intensely, actually, the work of my graduate students, many of whom are Latin Americans, for whom as well English is a second language. And I often recall that I do this, I sometimes do my hair.
Yeah.
I recall beyond academics, I was also fortunate to experience the warmth of Reid's family. Liann, his wife, Roy, graciously invited me to spend Thanksgiving holidays with them. Their hospitality coupled with Roy's, because I don't think it was really and the thought and love-provoking conversation made those gatherings truly memorable. I still chuckle when I remember learning from Roy herself where Reid kept the field research notes for his Afro-Latin. You all know the story, and all here, but it was a very interesting place. And it's talking a great deal about how careful Reid was with field research notes. He was afraid I might get lost. In the refrigerator, it was the spare refrigerator. In those days, your children, Lina and Jessie, were very young. Anif was about to be born. Later, I had actually the privilege to house him for the Andrews family. And I totally remember the lovely home, which, if I'm not mistaken, was featured in a scene from the film Me, Earl, and the Dying Girl, based on Jessie Andrews' debut novel. I love that house, and I know the entire family did too. I believe that is not your house any longer. Thanks to Reid's exceptional mentoring, I was able to build a successful career as a professional historian, far from anything I ever imagined, and much less in the United States. Even though I'm having second thoughts these days about whether the United States to be. But from him, I learned the importance, has been mentioned over and over, and I don't tire of saying this, the importance of clear, logical writing, grounded in solid evidence, and authentic to terminology, something that we kept on my case over the past. How I went back and forth in timing and narrative, and he said, you didn't do that. And to this day, it's one of the things I keep telling my students, is tracing the table back and forth. He really taught me how to think and write. I also appreciated from his training the understanding of the role of state structures in history, the value of social history, the value of comparative analysis that actually he masterfully displayed in a little essay that he published on the history of various Latin American independences. It's probably not one of your most cited pieces, but it's actually a piece I learned a great deal from. And I ended up writing extensively about independence as a result of it. Before concluding, I want to set the record straight on something that has, to my knowledge, not been said here. And it's that I was Reid's most accomplished student. Yeah, I know it was for just a moment. It lasted for a semester, so we 15 minutes because then other students came along, claimed the title of Reid's most accomplished student for your respective 15 minutes semester. But eventually, Reid's influence spread far and wide, shaping the careers of historians, now holding the positions at institutions everywhere, in North Carolina, in Winnipeg, in Massachusetts, in Florida, etc., etc. And if we were to include the universities where Reid intellectuals grandchildren now hold any track positions that these become even longer. Way belong to Saigon. Not only have I would add 6 other universities in and out of the United States, where students who are Reid's grandchildren are now having gainful employment and successful career. It was quite a privilege to cross paths with Reid Andrews. It's a continuing privilege to know that he will remain for many years to come. Its influence is impossible to replicate, but its impact is enduring, and I will be forever, forever grateful. Very satisfied customer.
Yeah. This has been a big day. Really big day. Been a big day. I do have comments written. They are not applicable. I feel they are quite frivolous to all the things that have been said. Oh, to all the things that have been said. But they're the only comments I have. So, may I? I'll go ahead. I'll have to take these off. Ah. Okay. Thank you all very much. Needless to say, today has been a lot to process. And so is 44 years of action-packed adventure, which has been my life. In order not to talk too long or stray too far from the spirit of the day's events, I wrote a few short comments, which I will now proceed to tear up and just wing it. A few of you may remember, days gone by, I would occasionally write poems to celebrate events in the history department, especially retirements. I hugely enjoyed doing it. They usually involved inventing a fictional, preposterous story about the person being celebrated, and then telling that story as an epic poem. For example, that the department's founder, Sam Hayes, had been hired from Ohio State in the mistaken belief that he was Woody Hayes. So that when Sam arrived in Pitt, he had to pretend that he was building a football team. Team member hired to play a specific position. And so the Faustian bargain was struck, and Sam's job ads made the round. Wanted, entry-level history PhD, able to bench press 200 pounds. Then we go through all the people here. They never quite mastered the fundamentals, but their secret weapon and their fame was reducing their opponents to complete catatonics by lecturing nonstop. From Sam 10 winning seasons, 10 ups, and very few downs. The ball was the year 4 of his Rhines received tenure and were drafted by the Cleveland Browns. Bonds tend to go. And I thought, why not write one novel? A song myself. Because as so many of you have commented to me over the years, I do contain multitudes. But today, I'm not in the mood to tell a whimsical story. Today, I prefer to be honest and to say what I'm really feeling, which is oh. I can do it. Which is water there. Oh, water, correct. Hydrate, aerate. Yeah. I had the operation, couldn't talk, terrible. Okay, what I'm really feeling, which is overwhelming gratitude to everyone for everything. I'm feeling mad gratitude to Keila and to Lara for organizing this event. I resisted mightily because I didn't feel that it was necessary, and of course it wasn't. But now that we've done it, I'm so glad you did. There she is. Together again. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Gratitude to all of you for coming to share this day with me. You really didn't have to. You did. Gratitude to the speakers who did such a fabulous job of telling things exactly the way they were. And now, my thanks to the Academy. Gratitude to my undergraduate professor, Marisa Navarro, who passed away just last month, and who got me started on this. I feel gratitude to my graduate school professors, Peter Smith and Tom Skidmore, who stood by me and supported me when I was trying to break into the profession during a very tough period of the job. I hope there's never been a good period, but that period was tough. I feel gratitude to the friends and colleagues in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay who were with me in the archives every day and who helped me in so many ways. In Argentina, to Eduardo Saguier, Juan Carlos Carvalho. In Brazil, to Miriam Ferrara, Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro, Yara Cody, to Marcelo, and now to Keila, colleague. And in Uruguay, to Tomás Oliveira, to Ben Gajosa, and to Miguel Garcia, who made me a candombe drummer. Gratitude to so many friends and colleagues in the United States. I can't even begin to name them all. But just most recently to Paulina, Jesse, and Alejandro, three of the smartest people I know, but an unbelievable privilege to be able to work with them. Gratitude to friends in the history department. Again, too many to name. But I will name Liann, Marcus, and Rob, because we've been old soldiers together out on the campaign. And Grinberg, of course, another old soldier. I wrote a great poem about Janelle. My mentor coming to Pitt after a first career as a cowherd and gunslinger in the open. 500 head to Abilene. 3 kids, 4 blocks to school. Gratitude to everybody at Silas, and especially to Eduardo Lozano and Marta Mantilla, who together created the Lozano collection that was so essential to everything I did here. I feel overwhelming gratitude to Pitt as an institution. As some of you know, I had a disastrous first interview with the history department and didn't make the cut to be a finalist. When all the finalists bombed their interview, how to do better. God, I did. It provided me every opportunity to do my job, to support my family, and to have this extraordinary career that I've had. My fervent wish to all of you is that you find the same satisfactions working for this institution that I did. I feel gratitude to my good friends, the rowers, who go out on the river with me every week, and especially to Carol Schenecker, our amazing coach during COVID, who taught us all to scull as a form of quarantine. One person in the boat, no worry about infection, and who ran Zoom erging sessions. We all had our erging machine in our separate homes, and we'd all get amazing. Amazing. And folks, just last Saturday, out of the blue, one of my rowing friends, Michel, asked me, what was the secret of life? Seriously, amazingly, I had an answer for him. It wasn't bad. After the talk, I'll tell you, well, I've had additional thoughts since then, but anyway, I think we were both amazed. Gratitude to my students, to so many of them who taught me everything I know about teaching. Well, not quite everything. Liann taught me some stuff as well. I'm especially grateful to the graduate students here today and others who weren't able to make it, who taught me so much about my own field. Victor, Jamie, and Gary Long were my introductions to Colombian history. Alejandro was my introduction to Cuban history. Jorge and Jamie got me to think seriously for the first time about the nature of liberalism. And I even heard about San Andres and Providencia until Sharika came. Actually, I had. And now I'm a world expert. They know that hold on, and now I'm a world expert, and go on and on with each and every one. And finally, of course, gratitude to my family. I don't know if it's they know that I can't talk about them without getting choked up. I'm not going to say anything more. They know their role in all this and how grateful I am to them for sharing all their adventures together. Okay. And that's the good stuff. Only the best of time. But to shift gears a little bit, and as we all know, the current moment is also the worst. It's the worst time that this nation has faced in my 74 years on Earth. A political party that presents itself as the party of law and order, and an administration sworn by oath to enforce the laws, is going hell for leather to become the most powerful engine of lawlessness and criminality that this country has ever known. Roy and I lived under dictatorships in Argentina and Brazil. We know what they look like. We know what they do. And that is precisely where this administration is heading. I expected many of you have been following the story of Kimball Abrego Garcia. Folks, I wrote these words on Monday. At that time, not everybody had heard of him. Today, everybody has. And you know the story. A man who has never been charged with a crime, who the government admits that it deported to face brutal incarceration in El Salvador by mistake and without due process, and yet who that same government says it has no obligation or ability to bring back to reunite with his family. Folks, whatever they do to Abrego Garcia, they can do to any of us, to any person in this room. And I guarantee you, they will do it. At times like this, I take inspiration from one of my main spirit guides, James Brown. Get up, get into it, get involved. I honestly never anticipated that my retirement might be spent serving in the anti-fascist militias. I don't bring a whole lot to the table. If that's what it takes, I'll do it. And in the meantime, Abrego Garcia has a GoFundMe page to support his family that Roy and I are contributing to. Closer to home, San Jose has a bail fund that takes on cases like his, and Roy and I are contributing to that. And at the national level, the ACLU fights these fights every day, and Roy and I contribute to them. There are many ways to contribute. It doesn't have to be money. Get on up, get into it, and get involved. And that's it. I wish you all joy. I wish you all gratitude. Thank you.